7 words. That is all it took for Britain's most meticulous field marshal to silence an American general in front of 23 senior officers at a Sicilian villa in August 1943. The words themselves would be repeated in Pentagon corridors for the next 2 decades, though the official transcripts recorded only that a frank exchange of views occurred. What actually happened in that room, and why it nearly cost the Allies their foothold in Europe, remained buried in classified after-action reports until 1978. The ceiling fan in the Villa Ferrara moved so slowly that Lieutenant General Omar Bradley could count its rotations, one every 4 seconds. He had been counting for the past 11 minutes, ever since Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery began explaining, for the 3rd time, why American forces would advance northeast toward Messina along secondary roads while British forces took the coastal highway. The logic was impeccable. The tone was insufferable, and sitting 3 chairs to Bradley's left, Lieutenant General George Patton had stopped blinking entirely. The room held 31 men responsible for the destruction of Axis forces in Sicily. Operation Husky had landed successfully 16 days earlier, putting 160,000 Allied troops on enemy soil. The Germans were retreating toward the Messina Strait. Victory seemed certain. The only question was, whose flag would fly over the city first? And that question had transformed a planning session into something far more dangerous than any panzer division. Montgomery's pointer tapped the map with surgical precision. "The terrain here," he said, indicating the coastal route, "permits armored exploitation at speed. Your forces, General Patton, will provide flank security through these mountain passes." The plan is quite straightforward. What happened next would be described in at least 4 separate memoirs, each contradicting the others on specific details, but agreeing on the essential fact. Patton stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. He simply rose from his chair, as if he had remembered an appointment elsewhere. And in a voice that several witnesses described as conversational, he announced that his forces would take Palermo first, then drive east along the northern coast road. This was not the plan. This was, in fact, the precise opposite of the plan. Montgomery's response came after a pause of approximately 3 seconds, long enough for Colonel Harry Aldridge, the British liaison officer seated nearest the door, to briefly consider whether he should summon military police. The field marshal removed his spectacles, polished them with a handkerchief that had been pressed that morning, replaced them, and spoke the 7 words that would echo through military history. "You are playing soldier, General Patton." The ceiling fan completed 2 full rotations in the silence that followed. Understanding what made those words so devastating requires understanding the 2 men who faced each other across that villa table. Montgomery had spent 23 years between the wars, perfecting his doctrine of methodical, set-piece battle. He had watched the British Expeditionary Force nearly destroyed at Dunkirk through what he considered criminal improvisation. He had rebuilt the 8th Army in Egypt through relentless training, meticulous logistics, and an absolute refusal to attack until conditions were precisely favorable. At El Alamein, this approach had produced the first major British victory of the war, a turning point that Churchill would later call the end of the beginning. Patton represented everything Montgomery despised. The American believed in speed, aggression, and the inspired instincts of commanders on the spot. He had trained his men to attack, 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 and when in doubt, attack again. His tanks had swept across North Africa in the spring of 1943 with a fury that astonished even his own staff. But Montgomery saw only recklessness, only a theatrical general who treated warfare as a personal drama rather than a mathematical problem to be solved. To Montgomery, a battle was an equation with knowable variables. To Patton, it was a living thing, something that breathed and shifted and had to be felt rather than calculated. The tension between these approaches had been building since long before the first landing craft scraped Sicilian sand. It had its roots in North Africa, where the armies had fought in parallel universes separated by geography, and where the different philosophies of war had never quite had to collide face to face. When the planning for Husky began in earnest, the collision became inevitable. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, had tried to balance both egos by giving overall ground command to British General Harold Alexander, while granting Patton independent authority over his 7th Army. It was, as one British staff officer later noted, like placing 2 fighting dogs in one kennel and hoping they would sort out territorial boundaries through reasonable discussion. They had not. The disagreements had begun on paper, in the cables and planning documents that flew between North Africa and London and Algiers throughout the spring of 43. Montgomery wanted a tight, concentrated landing on Sicily's southeastern coast, both armies close enough to support each other, advancing methodically toward the prize of Messina. Patton had argued for something more audacious, landings spread along the island's western and northern coasts, cutting off the Axis garrison from the start and seizing Palermo, the island's capital and largest port, in the opening days. Montgomery's plan won. It won partly because it was more conservative and therefore easier for Alexander to approve, and partly because Montgomery was Montgomery, a man who had learned that battles were won by those willing to insist loudly enough and long enough that they were right. Patton accepted this result with the surface compliance of a man who intends to find his own way regardless. His diary from this period, released in stages over the following decades, records a simmering frustration with British condescension that had been building since the early days of American involvement in the Mediterranean theater. He wrote about Montgomery with a peculiar mixture of professional respect and personal contempt that suggested he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his rival's methodical genius was real, and also that it was not the only kind of genius available to a commander willing to gamble. In the villa at Ferrara, Colonel Aldridge watched Patton's face cycle through several distinct phases in the span of perhaps 5 seconds. First, a flush of color that began at his collar and rose toward his famously polished helmet. Second, a tightening of the jaw that made the muscles in his neck stand out like cables. Third, and this was the phase that alarmed Aldridge most, a sudden, complete stillness, as if every violent impulse in the man's body had been simultaneously frozen. When Patton finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Field Marshal, my men have taken 73 towns in 16 days. They have killed or captured 11,000 enemy soldiers. They have advanced faster than any Allied force in this theater." He paused. "What precisely have your forces accomplished in that same period?" The question was not rhetorical. British progress had been slower than expected. The terrain was difficult. The resistance was fierce. Montgomery's methodical approach required careful preparation before each assault. All of these were valid explanations, and none of them mattered in that moment, because Patton had done something that no one in that room had seen before. He had challenged Montgomery's fundamental competence in front of his own staff. The next 48 hours would determine whether the Allied command structure could survive its own generals. What neither man knew, what no one in that villa knew, was that the argument had already been rendered strategically irrelevant. 1,200 miles away in London, a committee was finalizing plans for an invasion of mainland Italy that would make Sicily a sideshow. The real prize was Rome, then the Gothic line, then the industrial north. Who reached Messina first would matter only to historians and wounded egos. But egos, in 1943, had a way of reshaping history. The roots of what happened at Ferrara went back further than most histories acknowledged. They went back to a cold February morning at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, where German armor under Rommel had driven American forces from their positions with a contemptuous ease that appalled Allied commanders on both sides of the Atlantic. Montgomery, watching from the east, had drawn the conclusions he considered obvious. The Americans were brave but untrained, aggressive but undisciplined, possessed of enormous material resources and almost no tactical sophistication. He had said this, more or less directly, to several British officers whose discretion he perhaps overestimated. The words found their way to Patton. Patton had arrived in Tunisia 3 weeks after Kasserine to take command of the shattered Second Corps, and what he found confirmed his darkest fears about what happened to soldiers who were not driven to their absolute limits in training. He drove those men for 6 weeks with an intensity that his subordinates compared, privately and not always charitably, to a force of nature. He imposed dress codes in the forward areas, fined officers for the unbuttoned collars, demanded saluting in zones where men were dying. His logic was not sadistic. It was the logic of a man who believed that discipline was indivisible, that an army which permitted small sloppiness would permit large sloppiness when the moment of crisis arrived. Whether he was right was a question that his men debated in their letters home, in hospital wards, in the bars of Algerian towns where they drank away the memory of what they had seen. What was not debatable was the result. At El Ghoutar in March, Patton's reconstituted Second Corps stopped a German armored attack cold, inflicting the first significant American tactical victory of the North African campaign. The victory was costly and incomplete. The Germans escaped the encirclement he had planned. But it was real, and it changed something in the relationship between American and British forces that would persist through Sicily and beyond. Montgomery acknowledged the performance at El Guitar with the measured, qualified praise of a man who had expected less and was mildly surprised to receive more. He said the Americans had fought well under the circumstances. He said Second Corps had shown considerable improvement. He did not say these things to Patton directly, but they were relayed through staff channels with the accuracy of a well-functioning military bureaucracy, and Patton added them to a private ledger whose balance he was calculating with precision. When the invasion of Sicily was being planned, this history sat in every room where the two men discussed logistics and landing zones and the relative merits of their respective approaches. It sat in the silences between sentences. It sat in the pauses before responses. Bradley, who had served under both men and respected each in different ways, watched the dynamic with the wary attention of a man standing between two artillery batteries, unsure which way he would need to run. Operation Husky began on the night of July 9th into the 10th, 1943, and it began badly for everyone. The airborne drops that were supposed to secure the flanks went catastrophically wrong when nervous Allied naval gunners, mistaking the transport aircraft for enemy bombers, opened fire and shot down 23 planes carrying American paratroopers. The landings themselves, battered by high seas and strong winds that had threatened to cancel the entire operation, went forward with the desperate improvisation of men who have run out of alternatives. Soldiers who were supposed to land at specific coordinates found themselves wading ashore at unmarked beaches, organizing themselves in the dark by sound and instinct, and the particular kind of controlled desperation that extreme training either produces or fails to produce. By the morning of July 10th, enough men were ashore on enough beaches to begin transforming chaos into something that resembled a campaign. Montgomery's 8th Army had landed on the southeastern coast with relatively clean execution. The British planning was meticulous. The rehearsals had been thorough, and the defenders in that sector were primarily Italian formations whose resistance, while spirited in places, lacked the consistency of the German units further north. Patton's 7th Army had come ashore on the southwest coast in heavier seas, and the first days were marked by a German counterattack at Gela that very nearly pushed the invasion back into the Mediterranean. The counterattack at Gela was the moment that defined for Patton what he had been saying about the relationship between aggression and survival. German armor from the Hermann Göring Division rolled toward the beach in the early hours of July 11th, bypassing American infantry positions and advancing to within 2,000 yards of the waterline before naval gunfire and the improvised heroics of scattered infantry units stopped them. Patton, who arrived at Gela by destroyer in the middle of the fight, was seen directing traffic at an intersection while artillery shells landed 200 yards away. Whether this was courage or theater or some inseparable combination of the two was a question his subordinates argued about for decades. By the time the Gela counterattack had been defeated, the shape of the campaign had already begun to diverge from what had been planned. Montgomery's coastal advance up the eastern side of the island had run into the full strength of the German defensive position at the plain of Catania, where the terrain funneled any attacker into killing grounds that Montgomery's methodical doctrine refused to assault without adequate preparation. He was stalled, and the stall had consequences that rippled outward through the command structure. The consequence that mattered most came on July 13th, when Alexander granted Montgomery permission to use a road, Route 124, running east-west across the island's interior, that had been allocated to Bradley's Second Corps. The logic was reasonable on its face. Montgomery needed the road to execute his flanking maneuver around Mount Etna, and this maneuver might break the deadlock at Catania. But the effect was to push Bradley's forces sideways, away from the axis of advance they had been developing, into terrain that offered fewer opportunities and more frustration. Bradley was furious. Patton, when informed, said nothing for a long moment and then asked his aide to bring him a map of the western part of the island. The map showed Palermo. What happened next would occupy military historians for the remainder of the century. Patton flew to Tunisia to meet personally with Alexander and presented his case for turning the 7th Army westward, toward Palermo, while keeping enough force in the east to maintain contact with Montgomery's flank. Alexander, who had the unenviable job of managing two commanders whose mutual contempt had become operationally consequential, approved the plan with the weary pragmatism of a man who has recognized that a subordinate is going to do something regardless and has chosen to get ahead of it. The authorization was real, and it was necessary, and it changed nothing about the spirit in which Patton carried it out. He gave the order in the early hours of July 17th. The 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucian Truscott would lead the march northwest toward Palermo, covering terrain that the Army's own engineers had categorized as extremely difficult for rapid movement. Truscott was a short, rasping-voiced Texan who wore a distinctive white scarf and ran his division with a controlled ferocity that impressed even Patton. He set a pace for his infantry that military historians would later study as an example of what the human body could accomplish when the alternative was losing a race to an adversary whose contempt you had been forced to swallow for months. They covered 100 miles in 72 hours. The mathematics of this were not supposed to be possible in the mountains of western Sicily in July, with roads designed for mule carts and defenders who had no intention of making the advance comfortable. But Truscott drove his men, and his men drove themselves. And on July 22nd, the lead elements of the 3rd Division entered Palermo to find crowds of Sicilians waving white sheets from their windows in a gesture that could be read as welcome or surrender, or simple relief that the fighting had moved past their neighborhood. Patton arrived later that day, and the photographs show a man who had reached a destination he had determined to reach regardless of what anyone else wanted. Palermo's fall changed the geometry of the campaign. It gave the 7th Army a major port, which solved the supply problems that had been constraining operations in the east. It gave Patton a platform from which to drive northeast along the northern coastal highway toward Messina, which was now the only remaining objective of any significance. And it gave Montgomery, who was still grinding against German defenses around Catania, the uncomfortable experience of watching an American army do something fast and dramatic, while his own forces were mired in the careful, attritional fighting that his doctrine required. The question of who would reach Messina first had been implicit in the campaign since the first landings. By late July, it had become explicit, a source of institutional pride that ran through both armies, from the generals to the riflemen. Patton had written to Major General Troy Middleton, commanding the 45th Infantry Division, that the race to Messina was one in which the prestige of the American army was at stake. Middleton received the letter with the expression of a man who understood perfectly what was being asked of him and had already begun calculating how to deliver it. Messina sat at the northeastern tip of Sicily, separated from the Italian mainland by a strait roughly 2 miles wide. Whoever controlled Messina controlled the crossing, and whoever controlled the crossing controlled the pace at which the Axis garrison could escape to fight another day in Italy. The Germans understood this as well as the Allies, and they had positioned their best remaining units, including elements of the 1st Parachute Division and the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, in the mountainous terrain between Patton's advancing forces and the city. The terrain was the kind that military manuals describe as extremely difficult, and that soldiers describe with profanity. The northern coastal highway ran through a series of narrow defiles where the mountains came down almost to the water, and where a handful of defenders with artillery could hold back a division for days. Patton's response to this problem became the signature tactical innovation of the Sicilian campaign. He began mounting amphibious end runs, landing infantry behind the German defensive positions by sea to cut off their line of retreat, forcing them to abandon positions that would otherwise have required frontal assault to reduce. The first of these operations at Sant'Agata went in on the night of August 8th. The second, at Brolo, 3 days later, came within an ace of catastrophe when the German defenders reacted faster than expected and nearly destroyed the landing force before relief columns could break through from the west. Patton, monitoring the operation from his headquarters, received hourly reports that oscillated between cautious optimism and something close to disaster. He kept the operation running. His officers, who had learned to read his expressions with the expertise of men whose careers depended on such readings, noted that he showed no anxiety visible to the naked eye. The slapping incidents happened in the middle of all this, on August 3rd and again on August 10th, in field hospitals where Patton had gone to visit the wounded. What happened in those hospital tents has been described in enough detail by enough witnesses that the basic facts are not in dispute. a soldier who had been admitted with no physical wound, suffering from what the medical staff called psychoneurosis and what Patton called cowardice, was struck across the face and ordered back to the front. A week later, in a different hospital, the scene repeated itself, with a soldier whose fear had manifested as trembling and inability to function. These were acts of violence committed by a general against enlisted men, and Eisenhower, when he was informed, treated them with the gravity they deserved. He did not relieve Patton. He calculated correctly that Patton was too useful to lose, but he required a personal written apology and a public apology delivered to the men of each unit involved. Patton complied with the technical requirements and violated the spirit of them, delivering apologies that his subordinates characterized as the most aggressive expressions of remorse they had ever witnessed. Whether the men who heard them felt apologized to was another question. Eisenhower received 2 cables on the evening of the 13th of August. The first, from Montgomery's headquarters, reported that American forces appeared inclined toward independent action that might compromise the integrity of the operational plan. The second, from Patton's aide, stated that unless command relationships were clarified immediately, headquarters could not guarantee coordination with British elements. Both cables requested that Eisenhower fly to Sicily personally to resolve the dispute. He did not. Instead, Eisenhower sent a message to both commanders that has become a case study in diplomatic ambiguity. He expressed complete confidence in the current plan, while simultaneously authorizing tactical flexibility for commanders on the ground. He praised Montgomery's methodical brilliance and Patton's aggressive spirit in consecutive sentences. He concluded by noting that the destruction of enemy forces remained the primary objective, without specifying whose approach was more likely to achieve it. Colonel Aldridge, who read both the outgoing cables and Eisenhower's response, later wrote in his private diary, "The Supreme Commander has just told 2 men who hate each other that they're both right. God help us all." By the 15th of August, the German evacuation of Sicily had been underway for 2 days, and it was proceeding with an efficiency that should have alarmed the Allied command more than it did. General Albert Kesselring, commanding Axis forces in the central Mediterranean, had recognized weeks earlier that Sicily was lost and had begun planning the evacuation with the same meticulous attention to logistics that the Allies kept failing to credit German commanders with possessing. Ferries crossed the Messina Strait around the clock, carrying infantry, armor, artillery, and vehicles with a regularity that the Allied air and naval forces, for reasons that would be debated for decades afterward, failed to stop. The failure to interdict the evacuation was one of the genuine strategic disappointments of the Sicilian campaign. More than 40,000 German soldiers and nearly 60,000 Italian troops crossed to the mainland with substantial quantities of their equipment, and those soldiers would be waiting when the Allied armies landed at Salerno in September. The race to Messina, for all its drama and institutional importance, had not managed to close the door before the most dangerous portion of the garrison walked through it. Patton entered Messina on the morning of August 17th. He arrived with sufficient ceremony for a man who had been racing toward this moment for 5 weeks, and the photographs show him in the central piazza with the composed expression of someone who has achieved what he intended and is allowing himself a moment of controlled satisfaction before moving on to the next problem. British reconnaissance elements arrived several hours later. Montgomery himself did not come to Messina that day. The meeting that followed occurred at Allied headquarters in Algiers 3 days later. No official transcript exists in the declassified record. What survives are fragments, diary entries, letters home, the recollections of staff officers who waited in adjacent rooms and heard raised voices through closed doors. Pemberton was present for the first 40 minutes. According to his personal journal, donated to the Imperial War Museum by his family in 1987, the conversation began with Montgomery presenting a detailed analysis of how Patton's approach had affected the overall campaign. Supply lines had been stretched beyond acceptable limits. Coordination with naval support had been compromised at Brolo. The careful operational timing that had characterized the North African victory had been replaced with what Montgomery called theatrical improvisation. Patton's response, as recorded by Pemberton, consisted of 14 words. "We won. The Germans are gone. And I got there first." The argument that followed lasted approximately 90 minutes. Neither commander emerged having changed the other's fundamental position. But something had shifted in the relationship between American and British forces, something that would persist through Normandy, through the Ardennes, through the final advance into Germany itself. It was not hostility exactly, though hostility was present. It was more like the mutual recognition of two men who have finally understood, in the clearest possible terms, that they will never understand each other, and have decided to proceed on that basis. Pemberton left Sicily 2 weeks after Messina fell. His transfer orders directed him to a planning staff in London, where preparations for the eventual invasion of France were already underway. He never served under Montgomery's direct command again. The planning staff in London occupied a requisition building near Whitehall, where the windows had been blacked out since September 1939 and had never been restored to transparency. Pemberton worked in rooms lit by electric bulbs at all hours, surrounded by maps and cables, and the particular institutional silence of men engaged in work too important to discuss casually. He rarely spoke of Sicily except when directly asked, and he had learned to discourage direct questions with a brevity that his colleagues interpreted as military discretion. What he carried from Sicily was not information, exactly, and not trauma in the clinical sense, but something that resisted the categories available to him. He had been a capable officer who believed in method and preparation, and the virtues of doing things correctly, according to principles that had been worked out over centuries of European warfare. He had watched Patton read Montgomery's message in that command post outside the city, and something in what he had seen had shifted the ground beneath those beliefs in ways he could not fully articulate. It was not that he thought Patton was right and Montgomery wrong. He was British, and he had been formed by the same institution that formed Montgomery, and he believed in its values with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who had never had serious cause to question them. But he had also seen something in that moment with the letter that he could not fit into the framework those values provided. He had seen a man read words on paper, understand them completely, and treat them as categorically irrelevant. Not because he disagreed with their content or disputed their authority, but because the dimension in which they operated was simply not the dimension he was operating in. Pemberton tried to explain this to his wife on a November evening in 1943, sitting in the kitchen of their flat in Kensington, while the blackout curtains kept the world outside invisible. She was a practical woman who had spent 4 years managing their household through rationing and uncertainty, and she listened to him with the careful attention she gave everything. But she could see that whatever he was trying to say was not coming out correctly. He said something about generals. He said something about maps versus the ground. He said that there was a kind of intelligence that did not operate through plans, and that he did not know whether this made it more or less dangerous than the kind that did. His wife poured him more tea and told him that she thought he probably needed sleep, and he agreed that this was likely true, and they did not discuss it again for a long time. The question of what the Sicilian campaign had accomplished, beyond the obvious geographic and political gains, occupied military analysts for the remainder of the decade and beyond. The island had been taken in 38 days, which was faster than most pre-war planners had considered possible. Mussolini had fallen, which nobody had predicted, and which changed the political configuration of the war in ways that were still being calculated when the guns finally stopped. Italy had begun the negotiations that would lead to the armistice of September 8th, opening the possibility, though not the certainty, of an Allied landing on the mainland. Against these achievements had to be set the cost, and the cost was real. More than 24,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The evacuation through the Messina Strait had allowed the most dangerous German formations to escape and fight again. The failure of Allied air and naval interdiction in the strait would be studied in staff colleges as an example of what happened when coordination between services was inadequate, and when the urgency of preventing an evacuation was recognized too late. Bradley, who had watched the entire campaign from his position as Second Corps commander, and who had spent much of it managing the consequences of decisions made above and around him, left Sicily with the measured conclusions of a man who processed experience through the filter of institutional loyalty. He believed the campaign had been managed with less coordination than the situation required. He believed that the allocation of Route 124 to Montgomery had been a mistake. He believed that Patton's seizure of Palermo, while authorized and ultimately successful, had created supply complications that could have been avoided. He wrote none of this in the cables he sent to Eisenhower because he understood that military correspondence was not the appropriate vehicle for views of this kind, and that their time would come. Their time came at Normandy, And in the long arguments over strategy that characterized the final year of the war in Europe, and in the memoirs that both men eventually published in the decade after the fighting ended. By then, the specific arguments of Sicily had been absorbed into larger arguments about the nature of the alliance and the competing national interests that the alliance contained, and the precise events of July and August 1943 were referenced more often than they were actually examined. Years later, in interviews conducted for a BBC documentary that was never completed, Pemberton attempted to describe what he had witnessed during those final days in Sicily. The recordings, preserved in the BBC archives, capture a man struggling with language that seemed inadequate for the experience he was trying to convey. The thing about Patton, he said in one segment, was that he didn't operate according to any system I recognized. It wasn't that he was reckless exactly. It was that he seemed to be playing a different game entirely, one where the rules I had learned simply didn't apply. The interviewer asked him to elaborate. I can't really, Pemberton admitted. I've tried explaining it to my wife, to my children, to colleagues who served in other theaters. The words come out, but they don't capture it. There was something about watching him read that message, the one where Montgomery essentially ordered him to stop, and knowing, absolutely knowing, that he would do precisely the opposite. Not out of spite, not out of ego, though God knows there was ego involved, but because stopping simply wasn't something he could do. It wasn't in the vocabulary. He paused. The recording captures approximately 8 seconds of silence. You have to understand, he continued, that I had been trained to believe that military orders operated in a certain way, that they existed within a structure of authority that gave them meaning, and that this meaning was not optional. I had spent my career inside that structure, and I believed in it, and I still believe in it. But what I saw in that room was a man who also believed in it, who understood it perfectly, who could have recited its principles better than most, and who had simply decided, in that particular moment, that it did not apply to him. Not as a rebellion, not as a rejection, more like, he searched for the word, more like someone who speaks a language fluently and then discovers that the conversation they are having cannot be conducted in that language and switches to another one without explanation. Pemberton died in 1994. His obituary in the Times mentioned his service in North Africa and Sicily, his subsequent career in military intelligence, his retirement to a village in Hampshire where he spent 30 years writing letters to the editor about local planning disputes. It did not mention Patton or Montgomery or the 7 words that had been spoken in that Sicilian villa. His granddaughter, interviewed for a podcast about the Mediterranean campaign in 2018, recalled asking him once about his time in Sicily. She was 14 years old, completing a school project about the Second World War, and her grandfather had seemed like an obvious primary source. He started to tell me something, she said, about an American general and a message. But then he stopped. He had this expression on his face, not upset exactly, but like he was trying to translate something from a language he had forgotten. He sat there for maybe 30 seconds, not speaking. Then he said, "It was a very loud war, darling," and changed the subject. She asked if he ever tried to explain it again. "Never," she said, "and I never asked." There was something in the way he had stopped talking that made it clear the subject was closed. Whatever he had seen or heard or understood during those weeks in Sicily, it wasn't something that could be shared across a kitchen table in Hampshire. It belonged to a different world. The question of what that world had been, what its actual texture felt like from inside, rather than as reconstructed by historians working from documents and memoirs decades later, is the question that returns whenever the Sicilian campaign is examined with sufficient patience. The documents preserve the facts in their approximate form. The facts reveal the outlines of decisions, the timing of movements, the casualty figures and the supply tonnages, and the coordinates of positions captured and abandoned. What they do not preserve is the quality of understanding that existed in those moments between the reading of an order and the decision about what to do with it. Montgomery's memoirs, published in 1958, included the 7 words in their context, attributed and factual, then passed on without elaboration. He did not explain what response he had expected, or whether the words had achieved their intended effect, or whether they had ever, in the years between Sicily and the writing of his memoirs, seemed to him like the right thing to have said. The words appeared on the page with the finality of a man who had decided that facts spoke for themselves, and that the space between facts was not his business to fill. Patton's journals from the period mention Montgomery frequently, the tone ranging from professional acknowledgement to barely contained contempt, but the 7 words themselves do not appear. This absence is itself a form of evidence, though what it is evidence of depends on the theory of Patton one brings to the question. He may have dismissed the phrase as beneath notice. He may have understood it as a compliment misdelivered. He may have simply not registered it as the kind of thing that required a response in writing, preferring to respond in the way he always responded, by moving and by winning. The command post where Montgomery's message had been delivered was demolished in 1951, replaced by an apartment building that still stands on the outskirts of what is now a moderately prosperous Sicilian town. No plaque marks the location. No memorial identifies it as the site where 2 Allied commanders conducted their most consequential disagreement. The families who live in the building know nothing of what occurred on the ground beneath their foundations, and there is no particular reason they should. The message itself, the one directing Patton to assume the defensive and halt his advance, was filed in the Army's historical records. It was declassified in 1973, along with thousands of other operational documents from the Mediterranean theater. Military historians have cited it in numerous books and articles, analyzing its phrasing, its implications, its place in the broader narrative of Allied command relationships in the Second World War. None of these analyses have captured what Pemberton saw in that room, a general reading words on paper, understanding them completely, and choosing to treat them as irrelevant. The expression on Patton's face as he considered whether Montgomery honestly expected him to stop. The answer that was never given because no answer was required. The 7 words that started everything, spoken in that Sicilian villa on an August afternoon while a ceiling fan completed its slow rotations above a room full of men who understood, if they were honest with themselves, that they were watching something that did not fit into any of the categories they had been given for understanding war, appeared in Montgomery's memoir without comment or regret. He had said them. He had meant them. Whether they were true was a question he apparently considered settled. Pemberton, in his final years, kept a small notebook in which he recorded fragments of memory from his military service. His family found it after his death, tucked into a drawer with his discharge papers and a handful of faded photographs. Most entries were mundane: weather conditions, meal schedules, the names of colleagues he had served with and lost track of and occasionally thought about on quiet evenings. One entry, dated simply Sicily 43, contained a single sentence. His handwriting, always precise, had grown unsteady with age, but the words remained legible. He was still playing.